how does sensory sensation actually occur? We go through what we call a transduction pathway. And essentially what this means is we've got to look for how we get action potentials firing to your brain and sending information back. So transduction is your sensory receptor is going to generate a nerve impulse. From that, we get conduction. So this is your receptor or your sense organ, if you're talking about like your nose or something. And it's going to send information to your CNS, in particular to your cerebral cortex. We've got to process this information. Translation is the DNA in your cerebral cortex is going to say, I know what that is. And that gets transferred into a sensation. Remember, sensation can be any stimuli. Your brain hasn't interpreted yet. What your brain is waiting for is your DNA to say, this is a particular sensation, and then your brain tells you specifically, tells your consciousness specifically what that sensation is or what that sense is. So this is where you get the difference between skunk versus chocolate chip cookies. That's a very important distinction. But for us, we don't know anything about it as far as a conscious awareness of that stimulus until this very last step. Everything else is chemical and electrical. And what we look for is something known as modality. And modality is how we differentiate things like temperature and light and sound and chemical changes and all of this. What we have to be careful of is modality is specific to each receptor. This is getting back to the idea that we said before, that we don't want your eyes to be full of taste buds. That does you no good, right? So I know there are very interesting medical conditions that allow people to see colors specifically associated with sounds and those sorts of things. But for now, let's focus on what's actually going on in the majority of individuals. You have one sensory or afferent neuron carries one modality, meaning that if you wipe your finger across your desk, you can feel that you're touching something, right? It doesn't taste. You aren't sending a signal to your brain of what your desk tastes like with your finger. You would have to lick your desk, right, to know what it tastes like. This is important because we don't want our receptors getting mixed up. We don't want to have our chemoreceptors that are associated with taste and smell. We don't want those to suddenly be trying to deal with light that we see, or electromagnetic receptors, okay? So when we look at mechanoreceptors, touch and hearing are all associated with mechanoreceptors. Pain receptors, these are weird. Any stimulus that is too strong will be sent to your brain as pain. It doesn't matter if the light is too bright, a smell is too smelly. It will be perceived as pain if you send a very high frequency of action potentials. Any strong stimulus can be perceived as pain. So we see these all over your body and associated with all of our different types of receptors. Thermoreceptors, of course, are particularly associated with your skin and your hypothalamus. Remember, your hypothalamus is responsible for helping to regulate your internal homeostasis. So being full of temperature receptors is actually really important. we'll talk about all of these as they associate with your different senses, but let's think first about categorizing your senses. So you have general senses. These are touch, temperature, pressure. Okay. Limb position, so muscle responses, something we refer to as proprioception. It basically means if you close your eyes and stick out your arm, you still know where your arm is. Okay. We look at internal organs having general senses, pH, things like that. And we'll also look at what we refer to as referred pain. So this is the idea that if folks are having a heart attack, they often grab their left arm. Why is that? Special senses are the senses that you've learned since kindergarten. Taste, smell, sound, sight, and the fifth is actually equilibrium, which they probably didn't tell you a whole lot about in kindergarten, but it's associated with balance and is specific association to your ears. So that's why these are special senses. They have specific organs associated with them. So taste, of course, your mouth, smell, your nose, sound, your ears, and sight, your eyes, of course. Okay, so specific organs associated with them. The general receptors, as we mentioned, are going to be found throughout your body, and we're going to deal with the afferent receptors as we've been talking about, sensory receptors. For any of these, but we have to look at how they are going to respond. So we do have different ends to our receptors, even though these are general or somatic senses, we do have different receptors that we look for. And so if we want to look for temperature, if we look for these free nerve endings, or letter C here, these are going to be associated with heat and cold and some pain. And you see that they extend into the epidermal layer here. But if we want to actually think about something as being warm, we actually have to go down to this letter E here. And you notice the large surface area associated with it. So this is what you get. So if you're sitting for a long time, your butt starts to feel kind of warm. This is why you've actually put pressure on your tissues, and your body is sensing that as warmth, and you tend to get a little fidgety, right? So depending on the different types of receptors, you see a bunch of different ones here. We see these free nerve endings and these light touch receptors here, and these other touch receptors here, all very closely associated with the epidermal layer, right? So these are light touch sorts of things, tickles and kisses and so on. But when we look down here at this big receptor, D down here, this is associated more with deep tissue, punches, sorts of things. And these are important because your brain needs to distinguish between whether you're being punched or kissed. This is an important distinction, right? So we have to keep these things in mind when we look at different types of receptors. Thermoreceptors we look at, as we said, for you all over your body, your skin, your hypothalamus, okay? But in some animals, like our snake here, he actually has a pit organ that's full of thermoreceptors. Why? Thermoreceptor is actually a specific sense for the snake because he has an organ associated with it. Why? They hunt by body temperature, right? By body temperature sensing. And this is how they can do it. They look for their prey that are warm because they have heat receptors in their front of their faces, in these pit organs. Proprioceptors, as I mentioned to you, is this idea of knowing where you are, whether or not you're balanced, how your posture is, whether you're sitting up straight or slouching, whether or not you're able to balance on a balance beam, all of these things come into play. Things like, can you close your eyes and touch your fingertips together from your two hands? Right? So this is your brain knowing where you are in three-dimensional space without looking. Your special senses, as we mentioned, are going to be associated with organs. So we have mechanoreceptors. We have photoreceptors for your vision. And we have taste and smell. We have chemoreceptors. So those are the big ones that we're going to focus on for the rest of our discussions.